Welcome again to this session about drawing conclusions. I just want to go back and think about how the working scientifically skills fit in with the types of inquiry. So you can see here we've got the 5 types of inquiry there around the edge: classifying, pattern seeking, fair testing, researching and observing over time. And then we've got the working scientifically skills that I've broken down into sort of simpler language. And what we're going to be looking at today is interpreting results and drawing conclusions. Because for me, they're slightly different things, and I'll just quickly explain what I mean by those two. So for me, interpreting results is looking at the data you've gathered, looking at the measurements, looking at your observations, and then using those to answer your question. And then drawing a conclusion is taking it that little bit further, where we've answered our question and we go on to give an explanation using some scientific knowledge. So for me, that's the 2 aspects that we're going to cover this afternoon as part of the Drawing Conclusions webinar. So let's quickly just look at the national curriculum to start with, and I've picked out the statements that seemed most relevant. So in Key Stage 1, using their observations and ideas to suggest answers to questions. So using my definitions, that would be interpreting results. Then in lower Key Stage 2, using straightforward scientific evidence to answer questions or to support their findings. So again, that's interpreting, identifying differences, similarities or changes, interpreting. And then we've got using results to draw simple conclusions. So here we've got that word conclusion coming in. And then when you look at Year 5 and Year 6, the statement is a little bit more bit more specific, identifying scientific evidence that has been used to support or refute arguments. And then particularly this second statement, presenting conclusions, including causal relationships and explanations of degree and trust. So it's much more about this explaining that we would be expecting. So let's move on and think about the progression of these things. So this is that one statement from the national curriculum in Key Stage 1. And the statement is in the green bar there. And then the bullet points underneath just give a little bit explanation about that. So I'm just going to give you 1 minute to read those. So I think the key things to take from this is that they should be using their data or their measurements, their observations to actually answer their questions. So they don't just ask the question and then answer it randomly. They carry out some sort of inquiry and they use that with support to answer their question. But often they will be looking for the best or the worst, the biggest, the smallest, those extreme ones. So they'll probably just give one answer to the question. So if we just sort of think about what it actually might look like, so the question is, which objects can be used to mop up a spill? And you can see here, to the left was my little spill, and then I used various different objects to try and mop up that spill. I did replace the spill after each one. And hopefully you can see there, if you look carefully, the difference in the results. And I would like you just to very quickly think what you would say as an answer to that question. And now let's look at some suggestions that children might have made. So child 1 says the sponge cloth was the best. Child 2 says the plastic bag was the worst. And child 3 says you can mop up a spill with a tea towel. When we did it, there was not much water left on the table. So we've got 3 suggestions there, 3 children answering the question or drawing a conclusion. What I'd like you to think about, is there any reason why you would conclude that any of these children may not be secure in drawing conclusions? And if so, why? Would you accept it as it is, or would you like to upgrade it? Could you just type something onto the chat? What do you feel about those statements? Okay, so I think certainly it's that question about why do you think that? So child one, as Ellie's just posted there, child one and child two have not explained anything. So if we think about the results, the sponge cloth, if I can just go back to the images, you can see there that the sponge cloth actually wiped all the water off the table, whereas the plastic bag, the spill is pretty much as it was when we started. So they're right in as much as the sponge cloth was the best at doing the job. The other child is right that it was the worst at doing the job. You could argue that doesn't actually answer the question, because the question was, which one could I use? You've told me which one you can't use. So in a way, the first child is better than the second child, because they have actually answered the question, but they have both looked at the evidence, and what they've said is in line with the evidence. And then the third child is talking about the tea towel, and you can see from here that there is some water left on the table, so it's not the best, but you could argue it will do the job, so it would be an appropriate answer to the question. But what we've got here is the child explaining how they know. So they knew that the tea towel will mop it up, because when we did it, there was not much water left on the table. And people were saying, we want to know why. That question why is a little bit tricky. Why do you know that? Because it mopped up the spill, as opposed to why was the tea towel the best? Because why the tea towel is best, we can't necessarily explain. We don't have the subject knowledge for that at this point in time, but I can explain why I know it's the best. And I think that's the bit at this point in time I would want them to be focusing on. So we might end up with something a little bit more like this, where the children are explaining how they've come to their answer. So the sponge cloth was the best, as there was very little water left on the table. The plastic bag was the worst, as there was lots of water left on the table. And that third one remains pretty much as it is. And I think for me, that is the child working appropriately, showing me that they're using the data to help them to answer the question in various different ways. But we've got to remember that all this inquiry that we're doing, we shouldn't just be developing working scientifically skills in isolation of any content, any subject knowledge content. So I would want to be adding this in as well where it's appropriate. So at this point, I would be definitely teaching the word absorbent, and I would be explaining to them that the sponge cloth is absorbent, and the way you can tell it's absorbent is because it mopped up everything and there was nothing left on the table. The plastic bag was not absorbent, and I would then expect them to add that key vocabulary and understanding into their conclusions. So you can see here that we've now added in, it was the most absorbent, it was the least absorbent, it was quite absorbent. So then we've now managed to put in the working scientifically skills that I would be expecting, and we've also plugged in a little bit of knowledge as well. What I'm going to ask you to do now is look at some examples from year 2. This is Max in year 2. Just going to give you a few examples to look at, and I want you to think about, is this sufficient? Is Max showing us that he's secure with the working scientifically skills of drawing conclusions, or is there stuff that you would like him to be doing in addition? So if you just look at this, and particularly that oral evidence box. So think about what that's telling us about Max's ability to draw conclusions. Then let's move on to this one. So they've been growing some seedlings in different conditions. And again, look particularly and think about his writing there, which says, now that I have observed our seeds, I think a plant needs these things to grow well: light, heat, water, good soil, care. What's that telling us about his ability to draw conclusions? So after a baby was brought into class regularly every other week, and the children asked questions, and the baby was also weighed and measured. And again, read the oral evidence. And finally, doing some research around what you would need to do to look after a dog. So looking up things and using a range of books, and then Max has put together a little Word document. So again, going back to the national curriculum statement and the additional bullet points there, do you think this child is secure? Is there enough evidence? If not, is there anything in particular that is missing? And if you can just pop your thoughts onto the chat for me. Okay, so I think I'd be inclined to agree with the two people that have posted so far. Max is not showing any signs of not being secure. Everything he's asked to do, he is doing. We could argue that we wouldn't want to say he's secure based on, 4 pieces of work, but certainly he does use his evidence. He's looking at the data, certainly in that first example where he's looked and counted all those things, and he's talking about his evidence there. So I think that first bullet point is there. And yeah, I would say he is secure on that. So let's move on now and look at lower key stage 2. And I want to just highlight those bits that I've highlighted in orange there are the bits that show where it's progressed from key stage 1. So now we need the answers to be consistent with the evidence. In key stage 1, if you remember, it was with support they're looking at their evidence, whereas key stage 2, lower key stage 2, they should be able to do that independently, and the answers they give should be consistent with the evidence that they've gathered. They should also start to make comparative statements. So we're talking about the further, the longer, the shorter, the slower, all that sort of thing. Whereas in key stage 1, they will often go for those extremes, the best, the worst, the longest, the shortest. And then finally, they should also start to be bringing in their subject knowledge. So as they learn subject knowledge, they should be adding that in. So they're not only looking at the evidence, they're thinking about how their subject knowledge links to this. So again, let's just look at some little examples. So this is where Max has used the calculator counter from McDonald's and has been choosing a suitable meal. Here he's looking at 2 skeletons and making comparisons between them. This is measuring the shadow over a period of time during the day. Just to point out that I often wouldn't include this in a year 3. I would probably put this investigation in year 5, where we can then use it as a context for explaining that apparent movement, the effect of the apparent movement of the sun across the sky. But anyway, just read the example. Might want to think about the language that he's using there. So here he's using a car on different ramps. So somebody was just asking, what would I do different instead of the, I would look at shadows outside as a context of using the sun as a light source, but I wouldn't then go on to do the investigation of how the sun moves across the sky. I would, as somebody suggested on the chat, do that in the classroom with a torch so that you can move the torch around, move it further and closer, and then that sort of thing as well. So yes, I would be doing it in the classroom rather than outside. So let's go back and think about these, the working scientifically objectives. So again, if you can just think about the working scientifically objectives, and then, so I'm getting distracted because one of our computers has crashed, but I'm just going to carry on anyway. Think about those objectives and think about whether you think Max is secure or whether he needs more support or some more opportunities. Is there anything missing? Yeah, I agree with you, Monique. The bit that I'm particularly concerned about is that comparative language. He talks about the longest shadows, the shortest shadows. He's not using that comparative language. The answers are consistent with the evidence that he's got. So in that respect, I would think he's doing quite well. I think he falls short on that second bullet point there, the comparative statements. Quite a lot of it does have the appropriate knowledge. So I think if we just go back, I would say, I mean, here he does talk about friction and the ruts. So he's got an understanding of friction and he's bringing that in. And then here he's using his language about repelling and attracting. So I'm quite comfortable with that. But yes, this is where I think he's let himself down. Here and also in the cars going down the ramps where he's just talking about those extremes again. So I would want to go back and talk to him about that language and model it to him probably a little bit more. So let's now think about what it probably could look like then. So this is going back to an investigation where we're changing the different surfaces and rolling a car across the surface. I'd like you to look at those 6 possible conclusions, and can you put them in order with the worst one first and the best one last? I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Yeah, I agree with you, Monique. The bit that I'm particularly concerned about is that comparative language. He talks about the longest shadows, the shortest shadows. He's not using that comparative language. The answers are consistent with the evidence that he's got. So in that respect, I would think he's doing quite well. I think he falls short on that second bullet point there, the comparative statements. Quite a lot of it does have the appropriate knowledge. So I think if we just go back, I would say, I mean, here he does talk about friction and the ruts. So he's got an understanding of friction and he's bringing that in. And then here he's using his language about repelling and attracting. So I'm quite comfortable with that. But yes, this is where I think he's let himself down. Here and also in the cars going down the ramps where he's just talking about those extremes again. So I would want to go back and talk to him about that language and model it to him probably a little bit more. So let's now think about what it probably could look like then. So this is going back to an investigation where we're changing the different surfaces and rolling a car across the surface. I'd like you to look at those 6 possible conclusions, and can you put them in order with the worst one first and the best one last? I'll give you a couple of minutes to think about that. Do try and post something for me. Okay, so far we've got the worst and the best. Could we put them in order? Oh, thank you, Emily. I can see you're doing that now. Okay, we've got a whole array of different answers coming in, and I think some people have done them from best to worst, and some people have done them from worst to best. So that's absolutely fine. I just wanted you to have the time to think about it, and then I'm going to talk through my thoughts, but obviously, you know, all these things are open to interpretation anyway. So the question was, how does the surface affect the distance a car travelled? And C is actually talking about something totally different. The blue car was better than the red car. So this child has probably wasn't involved in coming up with that question and therefore has gone off and done their own thing, which is perfectly valid, but they're not answering the question. And we should be carrying out the inquiry to actually answer the question that we've chosen to do. The problem is the child probably didn't choose that question. They've chosen their own question for themselves. D, the kitchen tiles were the best. If you look at the data underneath, then you can see that it actually went further on the wooden floor than it did on the kitchen tiles. So we are now expecting them to answer the question based on the data consistently and accurately. So here, actually, they've chosen the wrong one. They're not looking at the data closely enough. The next one I would say is A, because actually that is consistent with the results. The wooden floor was the best, but we're just using we're using that superlative rather than using the comparative language. So then I would move on to F. Just need to move my chat out of the way so I can read it. The car went furthest on the wooden floor, then the kitchen tiles. It went about the same distance on the rug and the doormat. So that is consistent with the data. And it is at least talking about all the results and not just one of them. When we get onto E, which I would put as the next one, on the rougher surface like the rug and the doormat, the car did not go as far as on the other two. So again, we're talking about all the results and we're starting to include some sort of subject knowledge, a little bit of an explanation there because it's that roughness of the surface. So there's an extra bit of thinking, not just purely looking at the data. And then we get on to B, rougher surfaces like the rug and the doormat have higher friction. So here we've now got that vocabulary that we would be looking for. So the car does not travel as far. So we're linking the word with an understanding that shows that we know what it means, as on the smoother surface with less friction. And that is what we would be looking for the children to include. That's not going to happen unless we model it to them and give them time to practice and refine what they're writing so they get to that. So finally, let's move on to upper key stage 2 now. So here we've got a couple of statements there that we'll be looking at. Using evidence to support or refute ideas. And all the way through, they're supposed to be using their evidence with supporting key stage 1 and more independently in key stage 2. So what the plan team feel that this is how we get the progression into key stage 2 is actually rather than just looking at their own set of results, they'll be looking at results either that other children in the class have also found and use it, or possibly thinking about secondary sources of information and actually looking and comparing them. The results won't be identical, but is there the same pattern? So do their results get confirmed by somebody else doing the same test? So we can just be sure that we're coming up with the same thing. So that's the additional part there. And then again, we're looking for those causal relationships. So it's the language we want, but then also starting to identify any bits that don't fit with the pattern as well. So let's look at some examples. So this is after some research around the movement of the Earth. And then this next one, the good old M&Ms and Skittles in water. So here we've got, and this is the same investigation as you saw in year 3, which actually you may now see some progression in that drawing conclusions. So again, just having a think about the national curriculum expectations. Do you think this child is secure, or are there aspects that are missing? Thank you for those things that you've posted on there. I'm just going to go back and look at a couple of them in particular. So I think I agree with you, Monique, that there hasn't been an opportunity yet for, I think it was Melissa, wasn't it, to be able to compare her results with other people. And so whilst I would say there's probably nothing that she's doing that's showing us she's not secure, I probably wouldn't feel comfortable at the moment as ticking her off and saying she is secure. But we do have to bear in mind that she is in year 5. And so the chances are she will have further opportunities, particularly when she goes into year 6. So that's perhaps a piece of information I would be passing from the year 5 teacher to the year 6 teacher, that Melissa is on track and secure in what we've done, but we haven't really expected her to look at other people's results. So that would need to be built into year 6. I'm just going to pick up, yes, she does talk about that pattern. You can hopefully see the difference between Max in year 2 and Melissa in year 5 with that language that she was using. She was talking about the shadow getting longer, and she did also spot that actually the data was incomplete, which was good. And then I'm just going to come to Alison's question at the end, or her point about the explanation of diffusion in the colours in the water from the Skittles and why they remain separate. And I think that's one of those things that you have to recognise. What is it we expect the child to know? I would expect them to talk about the sugar dissolving and spreading into the water. The word diffusion isn't actually part of the in the plan resources. It's not included as one of the key vocabulary words, so I wouldn't necessarily expect that. And actually, I would struggle to explain why they don't, why they remain separate. And I think that's an important point when we're asking children to draw conclusions. Only ask them to explain why if they know the answer to that question, because sometimes there isn't an answer to that question and we don't know why. There isn't a why, and sometimes it's too tricky. The subject knowledge is going to be too difficult. So before you ask a child to explain why, always make sure you can do it yourself. That's my top tip on that one. Okay, so just because this seems to arise a lot, do the children have to write their conclusions down? It is good for the children to practice writing things down if they can write. If they can't write, then that doesn't mean they shouldn't be expected to draw conclusions. It's just down to the teacher to be able to capture those conclusions in a different way. Writing is one way of presenting our scientific conclusions. Verbally would be another way. I think we should encourage the children to draw their conclusions and present their conclusions in as many different ways as they can. If you want them to dance it, then go for it. But I certainly wouldn't say you can't assess a child to be secure on a skill just because they can't write it down. Okay, so that's the end of what I'm going to share with you this afternoon. If you do have any examples of conclusions, particularly if you've got anything where the children are looking and comparing their results with somebody else's, because that's certainly the bit that actually at the moment we don't have in the plan resources at all. So if you do happen to have a year 5 or year 6 class, a set of books at home, and you know that you've done that, I would really love it if you could send those examples in for me. Perhaps a really good example where they've done that bit of comparison, and then some other examples as well that perhaps aren't quite as good, because we're trying to develop these resources a little bit further. Have a lovely half-term holiday. Please try and have a break and do something different. Thank you very much. Goodbye.